What I want to do this evening is to reflect on the journey of Garland magazine, where it's come from and where it's going now, in terms of the question of the knowledge produced by craft. Now we think back to what are iconic myths regarding crafts: Homo faber, man the maker, the artificer. This concept, of course, has problems in an information economy where you're dealing with immaterial things like knowledge. How do we place making in relationship to the growth of education, the development of social media, all the elements of the knowledge economy that we've seen rise of late. But I thought it'd be good to start with a point of reference where the two seem to converge. And if we go back to the late 18th century, of course, we have the grand project of the Encyclopédie by D'Alembert and Diderot. Over 24 years, they compiled information about all the knowledge that could be gathered of both nature and human endeavour. 28 volumes, and of course one of the aspects of it that we reflect on particularly are these plates by Jacques-Louis Goussier, who spent 15 years drawing workshops of makers. And so the way in which the mechanical arts was seen as a key part of human knowledge at that time, at this quintessence of the Enlightenment, is something which is quite remarkable and remains so. But these days, with a more democratic eye, we might also ask, well, what did the makers themselves think of this? Could any of them afford the Encyclopédie? What did they think of somebody coming into their workshops, drawing what they were doing? What were their interests in being reflected? Of course, we don't hear those sorts of voices. There was something similar to this that occurred to me a few years ago when I was listening to someone launch a book in an organisation in Australia called AsiaLink. So, as you know, Australia is a nation, predominantly Western, but in the Eastern Hemisphere. So we try as much as possible to get to know our neighbours in the region. And this book was about the practice of local Islamic prayer in Indonesia. And the argument was that these were quite localised practices that reflected a diversity in Islamic practice that was unusual at a time when Wahhabism or the standardisation of Islam was very much afoot in the nation. I thought this was a quite interesting reflection on what's happening in Indonesia, so I asked the author what the Islamic practitioners thought about having their prayers and their practices reflected in this book, thinking that they would be very pleased to see that this was recognised and maybe even gain confidence that even though what they were doing was a minority or rare, that it was somehow important to be recognised. But what happened shocked me, that the author said, they haven't been told about the book, because to tell them it would be to corrupt the data. Once they knew that I was writing a book, they would tell me something differently. And I reflected on that and thought, how is it that we have a world where people go around studying and gathering information, and those who we glean this information from have no idea or interest or concern about where that information goes? So that knowledge is not just something of its own sake, but it's also a property, it's a currency that we have. So that was one of the kinds of concerns anyway that led to the development of Garland magazine. So with Garland, I just want to start with the object itself, why the Garland was chosen as a metaphor. It was done in conjunction with a number of colleagues in India, and it was really looking at, certainly across this eastern, southern hemispheres, this very common practice of stringing flowers into a necklace to be presented on a person or an idol as a mark of respect, as something special. And it's something you see, obviously there's the cliche of the lei in Hawaii, but going beyond that, it gets more elaborate in some of the other Pacific islands, and even in Islamic culture, say in Iran, or it's certainly in Indonesia there with the jasmine, and the idols in India, and versions of it in Aboriginal culture, and in weddings in India, and even in Mexico, going on and on and on. Now, the garland is, to an extent, a craft. It's like a necklace, of course, so it does have an element of jewellery, but the key feature is that it doesn't last, maybe 3 days, which is perhaps why it's a useful thing to give a guest, because 3 days is about the time that you welcome a guest for. So how is it that we don't have a language for thinking about this as a practice, the garland? It also being an object of welcome and something which marks something special, it seemed like an auspicious symbol, motif to begin, particularly since, in essence, it's a circle. And to a degree, the idea of including those agents who provide knowledge in the knowledge making is a kind of circular knowledge, in the same way we talk about a circular economy, that we extract value from the environment and we put value back, that we're extracting knowledge and there's a reciprocal kind of relationship, that this seems quite important. So this is going back 7 years, so 2015 it began, and the idea was initially to do a kind of a survey to gather voices of makers from 21 different cultural centres, both cities, villages, towns, a mix of these, to basically ask the question, what is the value of what we make today? What does it mean for you? A very open kind of question. And just to give you an example of one particular case, which was the very first garland in Cheongju, South Korea. Now, Cheongju has a biennial which is the largest craft biennial in the world. It's quite a significant event, and it was an opportunity to get to know the value that Koreans place in what they make and how that contributes to a sense. So just as an example, this is an object called dokta, which in Korean means to polish a stone. And you see those blue ceramic pebbles. They're unpolished, and the person who has a hand in the pot is holding a polishing cloth. So the idea of this is that when you receive one of these, it's unfinished. It takes about 4 or 5 hours of polishing to really bring it up to its appropriate kind of sheen. So what the object is providing is not as much itself as the gift of labour. It's an opportunity for you to spend time. Now, I guess that's striking to us because we, think about labour as something you save. It's something which is a drudgery, particularly something like polishing. Why would you actually want something like this? So in discussions with a lot of Koreans, what we heard is that, labour is something quite meditative. It's something which is associated with mindfulness, and it perhaps is related to a Buddhist kind of practice. And also that Korea began as in the 20th century, as an extremely poor country where people had to work very hard to build up the industry, and the generation now doesn't experience the same kind of labour. So it is an element of curiosity about what it is to work like that in a time when that kind of work is more rare. Anyway, I don't have time to go through all the 21 different values, but if you have a chance, there's an itinerary on the website to explore. But the next phase from this was then to think about how it is that we can work together. So over the 21 issues, roughly 500 makers, writers contributed to this, sharing the story behind what's being made. So this is a kind of community across 80 countries, so quite a diverse range of people. So it's an opportunity to think about how it is that we can talk to each other given such enormous cultural differences. So in terms of work, the idea was to think about what it is that divides us, the kind of hierarchies that separate the way in which we see the world. And across the last, how many is it? 8 issues, we've looked at binaries such as the human nature binary. The up column basically refers to the dominant side of the binary, and the work is really to think about how they're related. It's a kind of deconstruction in a way, so how it is that they are necessary to each other, and to think about how making helps us understand that. It's an exploration in terms of what making does in terms of connecting our world together. So there are a number of different processes involved in that, and these are the articles that have been gathered so far from different parts of the world in this second journey. So it began with pathfinders. So with each issue, a number of interested people joined the conversation. So we tried to be organic, so rather than the normal kind of editorial board that sets a theme, perhaps more like the way you're curating the biennial, Christina. It's an attempt to let the voices emerge imminently in terms of what's happening. And we followed very much the Zapatista model of walking, we ask questions, that we would have 1-hour sessions starting with a question and then by the end of it concluding with another question that would begin the next conversation. And this helped us gather stories and concepts that would help us connect those two different elements together. The other element were the thinker-makers, and this is something that we've been talking a bit more about at Gutenberg and will be in Kunstwerk. This is the emergence of makers who've often have a tertiary education, so have graduated with a master's or PhD, but rather than be absorbed back into the academies, practicing in workshops and so on. So a new generation, this, from what I understand, is something unprecedented, is bringing together theory and practice, and plus using new tools in terms of knowledge that enable this to be a kind of a pathway that expands the practice of craft. Doesn't replace the kind of normal conventional workshop by any means, but allows for the voice of making to be able to help elaborate a number of questions. The idea of thinker-maker was really inspired by an Aboriginal Indigenous scholar, Tyson Yunkaporta, and his book Sand Talk. He devoted each chapter of this book to a weapon that he'd carved, and there was a design on that weapon. So that provided the idea. It helped solidify the idea that he would present in Sand Talk. And I certainly recommend that book, but if you Google Tyson, he's an incredibly promiscuous talker. So he's on every single podcast you can imagine, talking about things from an Indigenous perspective. And we would continue to work with him. I guess one of the key things is that rather than just reflecting an Aboriginal or particular tribal culture, he's using that perspective to reflect on the rest of the world from particularly systems theory. So with Tyson looking at the human nature, he was able to articulate the idea of humans as a custodial species, and various Dreamtime or Jukulpa stories within Aboriginal culture that talked about why humans were given this particular role and what it means to be a custodial species in terms of enabling complexity in the world and flourishing in the world. So that was the first binary. The second one was Pamela C. or Shui Mei Ling, who is actually a paper cutter, but a paper cutter who works a lot with a lot of the new technologies, particularly that are coming out of China in terms of laser and 3D printing and so on. And she worked with some collectives that use 3D printing in a kind of community way to build connections and to allow kind of assimilation of people who felt on the margins. And to an extent, this combined the sort of traditions that she had with the new elements that were coming in, particularly around digital technologies. With Bridget Kennedy, she was a jeweler, and she was very interested in the value of jewellery, of the object. And so one of her projects, for instance, was she made these baskets, and the time it took to make the basket was actually the price of the basket. So if you were a surgeon and the basket took 3 hours to make, you would offer 3 hours worth of surgery. If you were a street sweeper, you would offer 3 hours of sweeping. But it turned out to be very creative in the way people responded. There were concerts, there was a whole range of activities as a result of opening up this kind of currency. And a lot has come out of that in terms of, although with Swish here and all the other immaterial forms of value exchange, there's, I think, an increasing interest in rematerialising currencies, which can still have a social trace to them rather than the more abstract flows of capital that we experience today. Abdullah Said looked at he was actually a miniaturist in terms of painting, of Pakistani background, and he was interested in NFTs. A lot of artists in particular are curious. I'm not sure to what extent it's proven to be as successful as initially hoped, but that it would offer an extra means of selling work, but in a way that bypassed the gallery system, so potentially more democratic. And clearly we've seen a lot of quite bad NFTs, like the Bored Ape, that end up becoming like playing cards that are collected. But he was interested in the democratic nature of NFT, and so...
Just tell us what an NFT is.
Oh yes, sorry, a non-fungible token. So it's a way of turning a digital product, like an image, into a unique one-off element. So you can stamp it, you can mint it. It's a process involving often cryptocurrencies. So it's quite speculative. And anyway, he made one of the lota, which is the kind of quintessential common craft object in South Asia. Just reduced it to an animated gift, and he went through the process of minting it, and it was collected and so on, so he could forge a path in an area that you would never think had any relationship to craft whatsoever. So it enabled him to be able to speculate on that. Then we had Temi Gilson, who's a Rudderong woman of central Victoria in southeastern Australia. And her work has a traditional element that we may be familiar with in terms of the weaving, particularly these objects called eel traps that are quite distinctive forms. But what she was interested in was, we were particularly interested in was how she also combines it with being a fire practitioner. As you might know, Australia has fairly severe bushfires, but that's partly because the traditional practices of what they call soft burning have been neglected. And so we have these big unkept plantations that take flame very quickly and dramatically, whereas within Aboriginal cultures, soft burning is a kind of farming. It's a way of controlling the landscape, and she was able to talk about it in a really beautiful way as a form of dance in terms of relationship to the environment, an understanding of where the wind was blowing, the moistness in the plants, the dampness of the soil. All these things come together in a very intuitive way in terms of being able to do that. Plus she also uses fire in making resin for her work as well. But today it's very important that she, particularly after the terrible bushfires we had a couple of years ago, that she works with authorities to assist in terms of the transfer of Indigenous knowledge from First Peoples to Second Peoples, which was a key part of her Thinker-Maker residency. Sarah Lindsay is a weaver, and she had a back injury, so wasn't able to weave, but carried her kind of perspective as a weaver into a number of projects. This was one involving nurses who are engaged in the front line, as we called it, of the COVID response. And this was a way of acknowledging their work through a textile, this particular scarf that was woven for it, and a number of events to celebrate their work. But she also worked with refugees. These are Karen from Myanmar, Burma, who are traditional weavers but worked with the Australian Tapestry Workshop to realise these completely unique and unprecedented works that used the kind of techniques which are traditional but much more expressive on the loom. So there's about a dozen of around 6 of these weavers who she worked with, and then finally was sort of reflecting on the writing about the process of preparing a loom, the kind of walking involved in stringing up the warp strings, and talking about the nature of the kind of repetitive labour in domestic life as reflected in that. So for Sarah, it was about textiles as a social act, and this was an issue that particularly looked at the division in craft between cutting and joining as a kind of a grammar of making, of how it is that we make a world through how we manipulate it. And finally, the current issue, and I'm very pleased to say that to an extent this is a kind of a launch of our December issue tonight, because it's coming out on Tuesday the 6th of December, which is already happening in Australia. So you get it a day early. So you can read some really interesting stories, particularly from some of the Swedish makers who, through help with people from people like Christina, we've been able to feature. Anyway, Kyoka Hashimoto is a jeweller. Here she is with work that was made from the byproducts of 3D printers that she was able to turn into this quite elaborate kind of necklace. And as you can see, it's not really, although it's on a child, but even on an adult it would be quite large. What she's trying to do is to, in a sense, reflect on materials that we don't take account of because they're seen as waste. And so it's looking at 3D printing, which we think is maybe a more efficient way of producing objects, but showing, in fact, that there's a huge amount that is, in a sense, not used in the end of plastic. And this was some work that she did with coal. So again, coal as a material that is critical to world energy, but obviously not so much positive in terms of the environment, but to an extent is a kind of mysterious, hidden object or material or substance. So finding a way to turn it into adornment is a way of acknowledging that, of being true to what it is that we actually do consider valuable in the world. And finally, the project that was part of the Thinker Maker residency for this issue was mining bauxite, which is the material used to make aluminium. So learning, this is usually a highly industrial process, but it was approached as a sort of an artisanal exercise to go into the landscape to mine this material and then to smelt it and turn it into these discs that could be polished and become mirrors. So in a sense, using a material that's associated with a sort of a hidden substrate of life as a way of reflecting our reality. And it also, for her, of her Japanese background, related to the role of the mirror in Shinto culture, which has actually come up quite a lot well, a number of times in Garland, the mirror, as the craft of mirror making as a kind of spiritual exercise. So, and that's very much the theme of the issue, Alchemy Now, is very much about this transformation of materials, not just lead as in the medieval practice of alchemy, but the materials that we consider to be waste, that are considered of no aesthetic value, into something precious. So it's kind of reflecting on alchemy in the era of the Anthropocene, when we're not only we're looking for alternatives to always using nature in our work, whether it's natural dyes or timber, natural timbers, looking at the materials that we produce that have byproducts like pigments made from brick powder and so on. So that's been quite interesting. Now the question is, with a lot of this knowledge being produced, the question is where we put it, because normally with knowledge, unless it's gossip or something ephemeral, it's something which we store, and we're used to in the universities, the academies, thinking, well, publish or perish. This has to go into an article or a book, something that can be bound, can go into the archive. That's the method by which knowledge is produced. But of course that limits the knowledge to circulation within the academies, which isn't necessarily the community that we're working with. So with Garland magazine itself, we approached this by thinking about the knowledge as a kind of a garden. And this draws a lot on the influence of Persian mysticism, the role of the garden in the sense of the order of the world. This was a number of artisans in India who developed different elements of the garden for us. But the key reason for the garden is that it's a space of diversity, that you don't have one species as you would in a farm, but the whole purpose of a garden is having complementary plants that support each other and provide interest in diversity. So basically, the stories are being curated. We've had about 1,600 stories so far. So there's a huge amount. So to give people an opportunity to find a way into it, features have been developed of the garden, such as, for instance, on the 18th of December, it's World Knot Day. That's K-N-O-T. And so we have a feature which is about all the stories involving knotting, which is actually quite a lot. So we have a little knot garden. So if you go to the website, that is an opportunity. And we have a person we identify as the curator who helps identify those stories and talk a bit about what, say, knotting means and its history and so on. So it's a kind of an almost infinite process with 1,600 stories, but it's a great challenge. But I guess the key thing is that it's about the pleasure of knowledge. because we think of knowledge as something perhaps we work for, we have to study and we have to remember, and there's all sorts of disciplines and so on. But thinking back to the very first garden, at least in the Judeo-Christian religion, it is a beautiful place, and we have to also think that knowledge was something that tempted us. It was something obviously lusted for in some shape or form. So this was what happens in Garland, but it became also clear that amongst the now is 700 odd writers, that there are a number of what we call scholars, people who are interested in the history, particularly of the crafts, especially a new generation coming through in Asia, particularly India. And so it seemed that it was important to try and set up a repository for this knowledge that could reflect the diversity of different cultures. And in this we're very influenced by the cultures of Moana Pacific, particularly Tonga and Maori cultures, where there is this idea of a knowledge house. This is a whare wānanga in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And a house of knowledge is a place that is welcoming. It's a place to gather. It's a place of poetry. It's a place of reflection, of conviviality, but also of learning, where important stories are told. And we've been doing a series with the Knowledge House, which has been going in development for about 3 years, but is just forging its sort of culture fairly organically in terms of a public space recently. But we've been doing a number of series called Reinventing the Wheel, where we kind of go back through histories of craft to kind of rewrite or write into them some of the stories that we're missing, particularly in terms of the Asian perspectives that have been missing from that. And if you go to that website, Knowledge House for Craft, then there is recordings of all of those. And what you'll see is that they always begin with a salutation, which is a very Moana way of doing things, that you start with a kind of poetic reflection and a sense of gratitude for particular elements of choice, depending on that culture. Okay, so I guess part of the work where we get to Lelio is in terms of the question of who owns this knowledge. We try and kind of present it as a commons, as something that is shared, but there is a certain legacy we have to admit to. And in this process, the idea is to use a method that was tried earlier in a project called Sangam. And this was a project in India. Sangam means where the rivers meet in Sanskrit. And it was an attempt to reflect on the way in which designers and craftspeople work together, and thinking about how it might be done in partnership rather than where it's normally, the rich foreign designer with the brands finds cheap labour to add an element of handmade to what they do, but to think about where the artisan has a creative element. So just as an example, that Sangam is a digitally, on Illustrator, designed work which is then embroidered. So working with an embroiderer to know not just how to turn it into something with thread, but to use their knowledge of thread to understand how it's realised. And we had roundtables where we, across India and Australia, we asked questions about things like, should the names of the artisans be on the product? And surprisingly, we found that in this particular table, this conversation, that the artisans said, no, we don't want our name on the product. We'd normally think that's something you want for recognition. And they said, basically, we want, if it is to have a name, it should be our village, not ourselves as individuals. So there was the website there if you want to go into it. But basically what we came up with is through this 3-year process is a code. We used an acrostic called Sangam, but basically it was a code of mutual respect in terms of the way in which it was possible to work together. And the idea with Lulio is to think about something similar, how we can come up with some protocols for knowledge sharing. And here I want to, refer back to the legacy of people visiting Norrbotten, in particular Karl Linnaeus in the 18th century. There he is with his twin flower, his particular motif that he treasured, I think was since called the Linnaeus borealis. I guess being the taxonomist, you've got the first choice in how you title these flowers. But before he became internationally famous for this system that went around the world to classify, particularly botany, of course he travelled through Norrbotten, and if you read his journals, you'll see not just him with a terrific kind of keen scientific eye on plant, but also this same perspective on what he would call then the lapse, in terms of the way in which various crafts were practiced with reindeer and so on in those small communities. But it's the same, the attitude is the same whether he's describing a plant or a person. These are objects of study. And within the Swedish context, I know that this has a kind of a legacy of what's seen now as a fairly repressive period. Measuring skulls was something also that happened in Australia too, so we understand, what it is to have a history like this, and this is from that film Sami Blood by Amanda Kennell, and it's about this Sami girl, Christina, which you've probably seen. Is it a commonly seen? Yeah, sorry, bringing coals to Newcastle, as they say. So what's particular is obviously the trauma that this experience provides. You understand what it means suddenly to be the subject of scientific study. And then that particular scene when she makes it to Stockholm, where we are now, and wants to forget her Sami culture because she sees it as something that renders her vulnerable. And yet everybody, her fellow students, basically wanting her to perform a yoik, is that how you say it? A yoik? And she is obviously, it's the last thing she wants to do, to be, this is basically like having her skull measured again. So the question is, in this kind of context, what would it have been like if Christina could have said, okay, you can measure my skull, and in return, perhaps you can tell me about other similar indigenous peoples like Sami around the world, and maybe I can get to contact them. Or, yeah, I'll do a yoik for you, that's fine, but could you sing some lieder for me as well? If it was an exchange of some kind, which is obviously not the case here. So on Thursday, we have 4 makers who will be gathering in Luleå to provide a menu. Each has 5 items, which are the particular skills, techniques, concepts, stories that they have to offer. Kyoko Hashimoto, Stuart Russell, who's the one who makes pigments out of brick powder and other things. And, sorry, that's Ida Isaac, and who makes material from the Maya, who dyes fabrics, and Katarina Spikskum, who obviously practices Sami crafts and reconstructs spaces. So what we're going to be doing is exploring a number of questions, like, what information are you interested in terms of exchange? What do outsiders want to know? Because obviously, perhaps particular reindeer crafts aren't that relevant to people in Australia, but maybe there's something there in terms of leather. I mean, why would you want to give knowledge to outsiders? In Australia we have a lot of issues around what we call secret knowledge that's meant to be protected within Aboriginal communities. And giving that away is tantamount to reducing your knowledge because you no longer have control of it. So yeah, in terms of sharing that knowledge, what sorts of conditions would you have? And you think of things like Creative Commons, that you can copy something as long as you don't commercialise it. So could that be a condition for sharing knowledge? You can learn this technique as long as you don't turn it into a product or brand it as your own. And are there particular protocols that we should follow in terms of giving an opportunity to know what these conditions are? And it will be just as interesting, in fact more interesting, to find that if somebody wanted to learn a particular technique that the person then refused because of various reasons, to understand what those reasons might be. And finally, how we might store this knowledge, whether it's something that could go into the public domain and why. So the idea is over 2 hours, perhaps it'll go longer, in your morning and an Australian evening, to have a barter exchange where somebody says, I'd like to learn or understand this particular technique, and that person says, okay, as long as you tell me this particular technique that you have, or concept or story or whatever is of interest. So it's going back to the scene of Sami Blood, to think retrospectively about it being that, and to come up with a draft set of protocols which are hardly likely to be canonical given that amount of time, but it's really a gesture to say that these are the things that we could talk about. It's not the 10 Commandments coming from the mountain, but essentially the start, the Lulio protocols that can start us thinking about how it is that we share knowledge, and particularly give people permission, if they are being asked knowledge, to say, to state conditions, to state, the claims of why they would be able to offer that. So that will be hopefully the outcome this week. We'll see how things go, but I think so far everybody seems in a very kind of generous disposition, and certainly my experience of Swedes is great kind of hospitality and openness to these sorts of possibilities. And in terms of the Garland story, to hopefully now include more Swedish voices. Next year we're extending the journey into the senses. So we're looking at the value of what we taste, what we hear, what we smell, what we touch, which are the non-visual senses that, to an extent, our aesthetics has not been able to understand or give value to, but are very important in craft because of its role in our everyday life as something that we have physical contact with in different ways. So stories from Sweden relating to that. I've already just today found a couple of interesting makers who touch on that literally. So in that sense, I want to thank you so much for listening, and hope that however this journey continues, that you will feel it's something of interest, and maybe even you can feel part of it. So tack så mycket.